So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Greetings, greetings. Thank you everyone for joining us. Ellen, thank you for the introduction. I'm Chris Jackson with the Public Affairs team at Ipsos. I am joined by my colleague, Mallory Newell, the co-lead of our public polling practice. You'll be seeing Mallory more often on these presentations moving forward. It's great to have her with us. She's actually been behind the scenes driving a lot of the public research we've been doing over the past 7 years or so is very well steeped in this data. And then we also have Bernard Mendez, our data journalist, who is behind the scenes helping produce this. So as Ellen said, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A application at any time to register a question. We will save some time at the end to answer anyone's questions. Also, all of this data is published public information. It's available on the Ipsos website. You're certainly welcome to use it. And then, as Ellen said, that this presentation itself will be recorded, posted to the Ipsos website, as will these slides, which again, you're welcome to use. We have a number of things that we're going to talk about today. It has been somewhat eventful since the last time we met about 2 months ago. We're going to talk about the new America. We're going to talk about Trump's first 100 days, the economy, tariffs, immigration, the federal government, the impacts of the administration on the federal government, and international relations before, again, saving some time for questions at the end. But to start off with, I think the thing that's just important is that we are living in uncertain times. There is a lot of change happening right now. It's a very sort of tumultuous period, a period that we're seeing a lot of differences or changes happening. And we're seeing that in our data. This is from the Ipsos Consumer Tracker. Just from February to March of this year, we can see a significant number of Americans, half of Americans essentially, expressing a lot of uncertainty about what's happening, and a pronounced increase just over the month. Again, sort of the first month of the administration. That's not even sort of continuing to today, where again, we've seen even more increase in this sort of uncertainty. And there's sort of 4 sort of things that we think it's important to sort of remember as you're trying to navigate this very uncertain time in the new America. The first is that, and you will have seen this in prior presentations that we have done, that there is a widespread distrust in institutions, a widespread sort of sense that the economy, the government, media is failing the people, the American public. But that distrust does present opportunities for organizations that are still able to seize facets of the public trust, are able to sort of claim trust in certain sectors or certain areas to really be sort of the trusted authority, the people that the organization that people turn to in this sort of moment of tumult. Number 2, right now, spending at home, sort of things that have a very tangible, real impact for people is what matters. Again, that distrust, that uncertainty is causing people to sort of pull a little bit more inward, a little bit more focused on sort of their families, their local communities. So rather than investing in sort of larger, sort of global issues or sort of abstract issues, people are looking for money to be spent in their communities, on their families, in their sort of local environment. So it's just important, again, if you're talking to people, to keep that in mind, to keep that focus on how are you able to relay sort of that very tangible, real benefit to them. Number 3, words matter more than ever. We're in a period where information and news is coming from a million different sources. There's a bunch of different people that are sort of playing in the same space. So being very clear and very certain about the words you're using to describe what you're trying to do is extremely important, because there's a lot of room for people to misunderstand, either unintentionally or intentionally, what we're saying and what we're trying to communicate. So it's extremely important that you understand what you're trying to say, but you also understand what your audience hears when you speak to them, because again, sometimes they're not necessarily the same thing, because the words we use have a lot of different meanings, a lot of different sort of cognitive loading, and it's really important to make sure that you're communicating clearly in this moment. And then the final thing to keep in mind is that even though we see this sort of the country right now and the popular perception of the country right now is as hopelessly divided as red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat. The reality is that Americans are actually pretty nuanced. And when we actually dig in our polling, for instance, and ask people about their actual attitudes, sure, we get like a top line number, half of Americans support deporting immigrants and half of Americans don't. But the reality is, once you start digging into the data, you actually see Americans end up being closer to on the same page than you'd imagine. So if, for instance, you ask about should America, and we'll have some slides on this in a minute, should America deport violent criminals who are here illegally, large majorities of Americans across all stripes say yes. If you ask, should we deport children who are brought here, young people who are brought here as children, most people say no. So there's actually a lot of commonality once you get beyond sort of the buzzwords and sort of the top lines. And again, we'll sort of go into this in a few minutes of sort of the reality that Americans aren't actually as black and white as it oftentimes is made to seem. Indeed, we're actually much more nuanced, and there is a lot more common ground than a lot of times we think. But to sort of start off, we're going to talk instead about sort of the chief source of non-nuance, President Trump, and about his first 100 days in office. I think I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Mallory, who will be presenting the next couple of data points. Mallory?
Great, thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here with you. Like Chris said, I am, kind of a new face, but not new to Ipsos's public polling. And happy to join Chris and Bernard in this webinar and just unpack all of the latest public opinion data for you. So today I'll be going over what our data is showing about President Trump's first 100 days. We just hit that 100-day mark that is significant for a lot of conversations around the media and kind of serves as a benchmark for how the president is doing. So we'll dive into just that. So right now, according to our public polling, the most important problem facing the country is political extremism or threats to democracy. Just over a quarter say that this is the most important problem facing the US today, followed by the economy, unemployment, and jobs, and then immigration. Now, if you're a longtime listener of this webinar, you know that this represents a shift. Political extremism has always been sort of at the top, but not the top issue. And that has really changed over a period of time. In recent weeks, as recent as about 8 weeks ago. So now what we've seen is that political extremism has surpassed the economy as the main issue. The economy, as we know, was kind of the central focus to the 2024 presidential campaign and was seen as the main issue and really one of the significant advantages that then candidate Donald Trump had over Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, Democrats certainly are the main driver of why political extremism has surpassed the economy as the main issue. They've really strongly coalesced around this as the issue, but they're not the only ones, right? This is not just a function of Democrats being more concerned about political extremism. If you look at that purple line in the middle that's tracking closely with all Americans, you'll see that this issue has also been pretty steadily on the rise for independents from late last year, right around the turn of the year before Inauguration Day. And then same thing for Republicans, though only 1 in 10 Republicans cite this as their main issue, kind of on par with where they were last summer. It does represent a slight but steady increase among Republicans as well since Inauguration Day. Now, how do we square this with the issue that President Trump was really elected on and elected for? We know that most Americans, a plurality, 1 in 3, say that they want President Trump to focus on inflation in his first 100 days in office. This was asked more closely to Inauguration Day back in February. And that was followed by jobs and the economy generally. So you see that a majority cited something related to the economy. Again, he was seen as having an advantage on the economy going into the presidential election. And he really was elected under the promise of, improving the economy for Americans. And in their mind, that's really from a pocketbook standpoint, right? Let's get prices low, get inflation under control, and really get prices back to sort of a pre-COVID baseline. And so tying this all together, in our recent 100 days polling, we've seen that President Trump's job approval rating has been on the decline since he was inaugurated for his second term. Now, conventional wisdom tells us that presidents do have a fairly short runway to kind of introduce their mandate to the public and see how it does. And, many of these sweeping actions and reforms that the administration has undertaken in recent months, I think, are a certainly contributing factor to this pretty steady decline in President Trump's approval rating. He's now sitting at 42%. Most public polling has him in the low 40% range, and a bare majority of Americans now disapprove of the job that he's doing as president. This puts him kind of on the lower end of where presidents in recent history, basically since FDR, have sat as we look at the 100-day mark. And we'll come back to a little bit more on President Trump's approval rating and on the issues a little bit later. Chris will dive into that. So how did we get here? Okay, let's take a look at January compared to now. And President Trump's perception and job approval, we know, has continued to be highly, highly politicized. You see that Democrats and Republicans basically function as an inverse of each other, where about 9 in 10 Republicans approve of the job that Trump is doing. The president does continue to kind of hold on to his base relatively well. There's not been any significant erosion among his core group of supporters. Democrats, 9 in 10, disapprove of the job he's doing. Slightly higher, but not functionally different compared to January 2025. Where we're seeing the big difference is those in the middle, right? Those who are unaffiliated with either major political party. Back around the time of the inauguration, they were pretty evenly split on whether he was doing a good job or not. And now he's underwater among independents by roughly 20 percentage points. So that has caused that big shift over time that we're seeing overall. And now I'll turn it back over to Chris to do a little bit of a deep dive on the economy. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Mallory. Appreciate that. So yeah, there's a lot of different factors that are sort of feeding into sort of the political moment we're in. The economy, though, of course, is, I think, probably the key one to look at. Now, the economy is actually in an interesting place, though, because if we look at, we actually saw this morning GDP figures were released showing that there was a small contraction in the economy in the first quarter. However, when we ask consumers, what we're seeing actually is people are sort of in a little bit of a middling position, right? So our consumer confidence study that we field every month has in our index values at a 55, that's slightly above the historical average, though only slightly, again, suggesting that Americans are in a kind of middling position. It's not fantastic, it's not terrible, it's sort of in the middle. Other indicators, the consumer price index, reported job loss, also pretty moderate, not particularly high, not particularly bad. Again, suggesting that, at least on the metrics, on the actual sort of experience, consumers are doing okay. Now, the place that we're actually seeing a lot of potential problems is when we ask people sort of about what are they expecting, how are they looking forward, and this is where we see a lot more negativity, a lot more concern coming up. Here we have data from a ABC News Washington Post poll we released just last weekend, and we can see that about half of Americans say that their personal finances are unchanged since Trump assumed office, but 2 in 5, 41%, are saying that they've gotten worse. So a substantial minority saying that their consumer finances, their personal finances have been damaged in the last couple of months. And then when we ask them to look forward, if they are expecting a recession, that's where we really see the negative attitude sort of really dominant. 72% of Americans saying that they're expecting to see a recession as a consequence of Trump's economic policies. Again, pretty pronounced number. And that, I think, is contributing to, as Mallory was mentioning, Trump's declining approval rating on economic issues. Here we can see the net score for Trump, that is the positive or approve minus the negative or disapprove number across a range of issues. And you can see the economic related issues are the ones that are highlighted or bolder on the chart in front of you. And you can see he is underwater on all of these. And that's, I think, a bit of a shift because, again, as Mallory was noting, he was generally seen as strong on the economy going into the election. That was fundamentally his promise, was that he was going to restore 2019 pricing to a public that was getting a little bit fatigued of inflation, cost of living increases, and the fact that he's not done that, and if anything, he sort of added a lot of uncertainty and a lot of anxiety, has really caused his numbers on economic issues to really sink pretty significantly. So now, rather than his handling of the economy being something that's a net positive for him, that's helping pull his approval rating up, it's now actually probably something that's pulling his approval rating down. And indeed, we can actually see across a number of issues, his net approval is negative. His overall approval is at about a -10 or so. So you can see most of these are actually below his overall approval rating. The only place that he's sort of beating his his approval rating is on immigration. That sort of remains the one somewhat positive issue for the president. But everywhere else, particularly on cost of living, really taking a bit of a beating. And why is that happening? Well, one reason why that's happening is tariffs. We can see that news about the tariffs has really broken through to the American public. This is from the Ipsos consumer tracker Carometer that's run by our marketing team that they field every few weeks. And we can see that the Liberation Day announcement of tariffs really broke through. Large majority, almost all Americans were familiar with it. Almost all Americans thought that it was an important story, one that they cared about. And again, that's somewhat different than a lot of other stories that we see covered where they either people don't know about it or they don't care about it. It really is a story that has broken through to the public sort of consciousness, and it breaks through in ways that aren't necessarily favorable to the president. When we ask people sort of their views of tariffs, they're not very supportive, particularly tariffs on our friends and allies. You can see here just over a third supporting the idea of tariffs on Mexico, Canada, or just a 10% tariff at large on our trading partners. Again, hugely partisan response to that. There is a little bit more support for tariffs against China. You can see here 53% on the right saying that they support tariffs, larger tariffs on China. Now, this is 60% rather than the 130% that actually have been levied. We'll need to update this particular poll, but you can see again, a little bit of conditionality, and that's that sort of nuance I was reflecting earlier, that it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. But when we ask people sort of what they think the effects of the tariffs are going to be, or do they think the tariffs are justified, that's where we really see some problems for the president, with a minority of Americans saying that they think tariffs are justified if it causes price increases, a similar minority saying that they think tariffs are justified if it helps workers, and then a majority of Americans saying that they think tariffs are going to cause price increases or do more harm than good. Again, pretty partisan responses to these questions, but again, people aren't necessarily thinking that the tariffs are going to be helpful to them. And then when we ask them some specifically political questions, we can see that on the right, about half of Americans saying that short-term economic pain is worth it if it makes the U.S. stronger in the long term. This is part of the argument that members of the administration have been making. Again, hugely partisan responses, but you can actually see a little bit of like what a counterfactual world might have looked like, where you can see over on the left side of the chart that there's actually a supermajority of Americans who actually would have supported targeted tariffs at specific bad actors rather than sort of the more generalized ones that were rolled out. You can also see in the middle that there is actually a bare majority of Americans who feel like the country's been taken advantage of in global trade. So there is actually some that President Trump's arguments about sort of the system being unfair, there is actually some people who actually believe that. There is at least a bare majority who believes that, but the handling of it, the broad-based tariffs against everyone, that's sort of unpopular. If they had gone a more targeted route, perhaps there would have been a bit more support for the regime, because less impact on the individual might have happened. And then when we asked people before Liberation Day how they were going to go about handling sort of the potential cost increases, we see sort of a range of potential outcomes. A small number of Americans, about 1 in 10, said that they were going to stock up ahead of time, try to really cache a lot of supplies that they could then use over the months as the tariff regime sort of kicked into place. But then a plurality said that they plan to cut back spending, that they plan to sort of buy less or buy none at all to try to deal with these costs. And you can see, again, that that's most pronounced with sort of less affluent consumers, also pronounced among Democrats and independents. And again, it's just suggesting sort of the real impacts that these sort of prices might be having on the American consumer. So then turning to another issue, immigration. This has been sort of the marquee issue aside from tariffs for the administration. And what we see here is that despite the fact that the president's approval rating on immigration has slid a little bit since he assumed office, gone from 50% to 46% approval overall, he's actually still in a stronger position than he ever was during his first term on this issue. And you can see that on the left side of the slide with just essentially only a high of 40% approving of him. So it suggests that immigration, the politics of immigration actually have changed a little bit from the 2017 to 2020 period during his first administration. And even though, again, there has been some erosion in the president's popularity, it is something where he's still in a little bit of a stronger position. But we have seen that erosion. We've particularly seen that erosion because of some of the conditionality, some of the specific examples of what's happening. This is what I was referencing earlier about how, depending on sort of exactly the question you ask, you actually see a lot of difference. If you talk about criminals that are also illegal immigrants, large majority supporting deportation versus the version on the right, which is sort of more the generic question, deporting all immigrants who are here illegally, where you see huge partisan differences across the answer, the spectrum on that sort of more generalized question. And then when you get into some of the specific items that we have, or actions rather, that are going on right now, we actually start to see more Americans opposing them. So for instance, deporting students who've been protesting about some of the conflicts in the Middle East, most Americans oppose deporting them. And then when we talk about deporting people to El Salvador, to that sort of mega prison that was built down there, we can even see there a bare majority of Americans saying that they oppose that. So again, a lot of conditionality. And then the more you sort of push into specific examples, particularly anything involving children, you see even greater opposition to deportation. So again, a lot of conditionality, a lot of nuance, and how Americans are interpreting the issue, even if at the headline you still see that 55% or so of Americans saying that they support deportations. We also see that in views of what's happening with the federal government. If you're not necessarily as connected to Washington as some of us are, the administration's been very quickly sort of reshaping the federal government, getting rid of whole agencies, cutting staff, sort of really restructuring the federal government. And what we can see here is that the idea of downsizing the federal government is, broadly speaking, sort of popular. 55% of Americans saying that they support that. Again, huge partisan differences, as there is in many things. But when you get to specifics of that, you actually see less support. So for instance, closing DEI offices and firing those employees, which has happened, 40% support that. Dismantling the Department of Education, only 35%, a third of Americans supporting that. Freezing funding for the NIH or CDC or public health agencies, just under a third of Americans supporting that. Again, big partisan differences, but you can see that while the abstract concept of downsizing the federal government is broadly supported, a lot of the specific policies, a lot of the specific actions are not. And again, I think that's feeding into some of that decline we're seeing in Trump's approval rating, along with immigration, along with the tariffs and the economic issues. Then I want to go into international relations. One of the parts of the campaign last year was sort of this idea that America's standing in the world was not as strong as it has been, and that Donald Trump and his administration was going to sort of reestablish our standing in the world. So we actually just released data with our Global Advisor Survey asking this question: do you think that the United States is a force for good over the next decade or not? And what do we see? Well, from October, when we fielded it before the election, to April, when we just got our data back, there's been a 13 percentage point decline in views of in 29 countries of the U.S. as a force for good, from 59%, so just over half, down to 46%, just under half. At the same time, a lot of other countries have basically stayed the same. So like Canada, 78 to 76, Germany, 71, 71, unchanged. So a lot of these countries, no real difference. The United States, on the other hand, big slide, big decline over this period, as essentially we're seen as the reputation of the United States as a force for good has been diminished. And it's most apparent in countries that are our historic allies. So we can see Mexico and Canada, -21, -33 declines over that 6-month period. And you can see the green set of bars, that's the trade balance between our nations there. And you can see that among Germany, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, again, all significant double-digit declines in views of people in those countries of the United States. So that's what the number's showing is, do Mexicans believe that the U.S. is a force for good? A 21 percentage point decline from October to now, 33%. And this is at the same time that we're actually seeing some changes in some other countries' standing that potentially presents a challenge to sort of the U.S.'s position in the global order. This is just the trend, the net change over time. It's a bit hard to read, so I want to just jump to this slide. And this is the net change for the United States and some of our sort of traditional allies, the United Nations or NATO, versus countries that have historically been seen as more problematic actors on the world stage, which have seen an increase over the last 6 months. China +10, Saudi Arabia +8, Russia +7, as a positive influence on the world affairs. Again, not necessarily saying that they're seen as more positive than the US. Again, you can go back to this slide here and you can see that, Russia, Saudi Arabia towards the bottom. China, though, has sort of leapfrogged the United States, going from 39% to 49%. At the same time, the US went from 59% to 46%. So again, if the idea is that the US needs to be stronger, we need to contain China on the geopolitical stage, it suggests that the actions of the last couple of months have not really done that, have indeed sort of set China up to be seen as a maybe more positive actor in the world than we are. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about sort of what Ipsos is doing to try to help make sense of this moment in time, this sort of understand or know the new America. It's a very tumultuous time. It's a time that a lot of our clients are coming to us and sort of asking us to help them make sense. And there's a lot of challenges that actually break down into sort of specific industry sectors or specific sort of parts of your businesses that we can sort of help you make sense of. So, with the food company, how do you sort of deal with sort of the Make America Healthy Again push that's sort of coming out of the administration? What happens if you're a tech company and you sort of stumble into like a political buzzsaw because of some maybe misstated press releases or messaging. So we're rolling out a number of sort of initiatives, a number of sort of products to really help our clients understand what's happening, from everything from sort of a listening and learning model to trying to help bridge different sort of expertise or sectors, to sort of helping our clients measure what's happening out there, to establish a certain measure of ground truth to understand what's going on, including a number of different sort of products that we're rolling out to, again, sort of help help our clients reach out and help our clients understand what's going on in this new America. And if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to reach out to our teams. We're already deploying this. For instance, we had a session where Cliff Young, the president of our polling practice, went out and met with a bunch of clients, delivered a similar presentation, and then sort of mapped onto sort of their client base, their customer base, sort of what we expect the economic fortunes to sort of do to their customer base, their buyer base. So again, if you have any questions about sort of how can we use all of this insight to help you understand and navigate the new America, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I think we will take questions. We still have a little bit of time, about 15 minutes in the webinar. So let's see what we got in terms of questions, if any. Oh, here we go. First question, will we share this deck? Yes, when we post the recording, we'll also post a copy of the deck. You'll be welcome to pull it down, share it, use it, what have you. We certainly encourage that because again, this is all public, and I'll pull out the product slides at the end here, but the rest of it is all good public data and you're welcome to use it. Of this data, what surprises you the most? Ooh, Mallory, what surprises you the most?
That's a good question. I don't know that it's necessarily a surprise, but I do think that it is really interesting and important how quickly public opinion has shifted, particularly around the economy. You know, that much like COVID was the thing in the 2020 election, the economy and inflation was the thing in 2024. And Donald Trump was seen continuously as having an advantage on it. That's what made that election so interesting, because we know kind of going into that the candidate that leads on the main issue, you know, has an advantage the majority of the time, right? And to square that against public polling where he was consistently trailing, though it was close, that was interesting, right? And that was difficult. And I think now what we're seeing is that, you know, he was elected on this promise of being able to deliver lower prices and help people feel better about their personal economic situation. And I think just, you know, 100 days is not that long, right? And we know that there have been a lot of very broad, sweeping policies and a lot of change in that time period. But just to see, I think the pretty significant shift on the economy that's happened in just a few months is quite striking.
And I think to add to that, it's actually really interesting to see that pronounced shift, even though consumers are kind of reporting they're in the same place. So it's interesting how much attitudes and opinions and sort of perspectives or outlooks have shifted, even if maybe their checkbook hasn't moved that much. And indeed, that actually kind of went through, is true back all the way through the election. You know, the inflationary bump had actually ended for the most part well before the election, but people were still very down about it. You know, they hadn't really caught up to sort of where they felt like they should be. And you know, the Democrats were penalized by that. So it's actually really interesting how much, you know, yet Trump's views of Trump have changed rapidly, even in the face of like relatively stable material conditions, which I think again is sort of attributable to how people are feeling about all the things that are happening and the anxiety that has been produced by those actions, even more so than the actual impact of tariffs, which we haven't actually seen a lot of inflationary pressure yet, you know. So I mean, if we do, then who knows what happens.
Well, and it's interesting too, Chris, I think that history in a way is repeating itself. Like obviously the cause is different, but the fact that we're having these same conversations about panic buying, right? And are you going to go out and buy paper products or electronics or, you know, buy a car, whatever the case may be, feels very reminiscent of where we were this time, literally this time 5 years ago.
That's right. Yeah, it does very much feel like sort of the early days of COVID. I've not had to stock up on toilet paper yet, thankfully, but there is, yeah,
That's a
absolutely that
question.
concern. I mean, I went out and bought myself a new cell phone so I could get ahead of the tariffs. But then they were sort of exempted, maybe, sort of. Who knows? It's hard to keep track. Next question: are we seeing much generational differences in the data? That's a good question. And generation is actually a really interesting lens through which to look at the data. You know, I think so on the economic stuff, one of the things we see pretty clearly and pretty normal is that young people are much more exposed to the price pressures, to inflation, than older people. They're sort of being hurt by it in a greater degree. But we actually see a lot of really interesting sort of value shifts that are happening by generation. Mallory's actually been doing a lot of research with young people for some of our clients. I don't know, Mal, if you have any sort of observations that you'd like to share on some of the sort of the value or vibe changes that you've seen from like the millennials to Gen Z particularly.
Yeah, again, I think it is really grounded in the economy, and I think it's not so much a different a difference in opinion of the direction the country is taking, but just how you're being affected, right? If you're coming of age, and I say this as somebody that came of age during the recession of 2009, right? If you're entering the workforce, right, then there's this question of perhaps it's not like, when will I buy a house? The question for young people is, will I buy a house, right? It's, can I move out of my parents' home, right? And I think just the kind of macroeconomic pressures just have a different look and feel depending on your life stage or depending on your generation, I guess.
Yep.
And then I think there's ripple effects. Some of the research that I've been doing involves, like, for young people, how does that impact, a desire to have a family, the importance of marriage, and just I think a general question of meaning for young people.
Yeah. But yeah, lots, and we actually have pretty much all of the data we shared by age, so certainly something that we can make available if you want to reach out. How much is Trump's tone and manner influencing these results? That's a great question. It's not something that we are measuring directly, but I do think that maybe not the tone, but maybe sort of the style that the administration has taken going into this is contributing a lot to that sort of uncertainty that we're showing, that sort of like sense that people don't really know what's happening. And I think that's also just, I mean, it's sort of intentional. I mean, the allies of the president have said that, part of their strategy is to flood the zone so that people can't keep track of everything that's happening, so that it's easier to push stuff through. So I think that's absolutely contributing to this anxiety that exists, even if, it's hard to measure, like, is that specifically Trump's sort of bellicose tone or not? Will Ipsos be collecting and releasing 200 and 300-day reports? Trump at 200, Trump at 300, I'm assuming, tracking these issues. Will we?
It's interesting because 100 days is always sort of that solid benchmark, right? And we know that it's really used as kind of the measuring stick for presidents, and has been throughout history. And you don't really see that for like a 200 days, or I would say maybe a 1 year mark, right? Maybe we'll revisit this, next January. But I think the reality is that we are constantly putting out new public opinion data and new public polls. So I would say stay tuned, and we'll have a lot between now and day 200 and day 300.
That's right. Yeah, Ipsos will be continuing to produce a steady stream of new public opinion data. In fact, we had a core political Reuters release yesterday that didn't make it into this deck because it came out yesterday. But yeah, constant stream of new data, and it's all data that we are publishing on the website ipsos.com. You're certainly welcome to go there, check it out, check out everything that the team is producing. I don't see any other questions. So yeah, to sort of that last question, our next webinar will be held on June 5th. That will be our next Know the New America public poll briefing. So a little under 2 months from now, month and a half or so from now. So be on the lookout for that invitation to join that webinar. And in the meantime, you can certainly reach out to the Ipsos team. You can check out what we're doing on the website, where again we publish everything that we're producing. And always you can reach out to us for with any questions. We're always here to help out. Thank you for joining. We really appreciate your time today. I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks, Mal. Thanks, Bernard. Thanks, Ellen, for helping us keep this on track. Take care, everyone.